Welcome, welcome. We got another episode of The Weird Way today, and I am excited. With me today, I got Cam, and I am excited for this conversation, man. I'm so excited to have you. Only having a few conversations with you, and you've been so willing to show up today, and that just really fills my heart to have a conversation with a man who is so deep in this work and leading and showing the way. And so it's a great privilege to have you here, man, and really appreciate it.
Oh, that's so lovely, man, and thank you for inviting me. And must I say, I love the name of the podcast as well, dude. It's a great name. So yeah, I'm excited to have a chat, man. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure, man. And that is one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, because you are Australia's leading men's sex coach. And I feel like that is a category that it is popular, but there's also, it is different. It's not quite your everyday cup of tea to be working with sexuality and connecting men back to the sexuality. And the way in which you do it too is quite unique, of going beyond. It's not about a quick fuck. It's not about just getting somewhere, but to actually bring pleasure to the experience of sex and self-pleasure and bodily connection for a man. And I think that is something that's so important. And I was wondering if you could just speak into what exactly that is and why.
Yeah, sure, man. I guess like the reason why I do this work is I often say that the stuff that I put out there is stuff that I wish someone had told me about 10, 15 years ago. So as a younger man, I was like, as you mentioned just now, like I was pretty disconnected from my body. I was disconnected from the young women I was being sexual with, and I was watching a lot of porn, and it was just jerking off and just going through the motions. It was a quick fuck. It was quantity over quality. Every hole's a goal kind of approach to sex, as I feel like a lot of young men go, through, I suppose, like as a phase. And my journey with working through like my sexual, let's say like my sexual expression, or my like understanding of my masculinity and how it relates to my sexuality, really, it started when I was like 15, 16. And around that time, I was as a high schooler, I was bullied for, people thought I was gay. I went to an all boys school, and like I wasn't yet stereotypical athletic macho kind of dude. I didn't go to the gym. I was quite tall and skinny. And so, and I was, in touch with my emotions for the most part. I don't want to give you the impression that I was some enlightened 16-year-old, but I was more in touch than the average boy. And yeah, I was teased for being perceived to be gay. And serendipitously, my best friend came out at around 16, 17. And so I became gay by association with my best friend. And like, I still think there's some wounding there for me, that's still coming up like 15 years later. And, I recall one of my conversations with my girlfriend at the time, who, she expressed surprise to me. She was like, I'm surprised you ever asked me out, because I also thought you were gay. And I had similar conversations with my my girlfriend's dad as well, who like said some shit. And so like there was this wounding that had been created in me around that kind of like really developmental time of my, expressing my masculinity and my self-identity, of like, I need to prove myself, right? I need to prove that I'm not gay, right? Like I was still internalized that homophobia at that time in my life of like being gay is a bad thing. Even though my best mate was gay, still I was like, I can't be gay, right? That was like a big thing. And so I've worked now to really overcome that story. And I do that with men now as well, who also share that like similar internalized homophobia. But so I ended up leaving Australia when I was about 17 to go and live in America. And it was like an opportunity to reinvent myself, like, and especially in America, I don't know if you know this, but like Americans love Australians for some reason. I don't know why, but, and so particularly like the young American women really loved me as an Australian. And I had long hair at the time, actually long dreadlocks at the time. And I dressed like fucking, 2010 Russell Brand, with like chains and vests and tight shirts and stuff. And so especially where I lived in America as well, I was in Georgia. So I was in the deep South, very Christian, conservative. They hadn't seen anything like myself before, like this Australian dude rocked up out of nowhere. And so like I said, I saw this opportunity to like reinvent myself as like this like I really put on my Australianness. I really like, it was a bit of a running joke with my mates when I came back from living in the States for like a year. My friends were like, you sound more Australian living in America than you did when you landed here. And so I was like really hamming up this part of my personality, and like I was drinking a lot. That was like my identity, right? I was the Australian dude who could hold his booze and, you know, didn't really give a fuck. And again, the approach to sex was like, just get drunk, have sex, go through the motions. And really all that was a mask. It was a mask over my insecurities, over my anxieties. Like I said, I was really performing this, you know, to kind of get a sense of validation of like, I've got to prove that I'm not gay. I've got to prove that I can get chicks or whatever it is. And so I had like a lot of deep-seated insecurity about being perceived as masculine enough and fitting in with the fellas. I was a collegiate athlete, so I played soccer, so I was able to like kind of leverage a little bit of like the athletic status and be like, okay, this is the way that I fit in with other men. And the like all that anxiety, all that insecurity not only showed up like, I guess like psychologically under that mask when I was hanging out with the you know, my mates, the male peer group that I had, but also when I was sexual as well. Like I was manifesting this anxiety as premature ejaculation, as erectile dysfunction, and a lot of performance anxiety. You know, I was like really hyper concerned with being a man, being masculine, not being like lesser than, like being the initiator of sex, having a lot of sex, really stereotypical narratives around masculinity. And my way of dealing with that, like I kind of mentioned, was just getting drunk. Yeah. You know, like I'll get wasted, and if I have shit sex, then I can blame it on the booze. Like alcohol became my scapegoat. And you know, at the end of the day, when I really think back to it, like I wasn't necessarily having sex for me. I wasn't even having sex for the young women that I was being sexual with. I was having sex for my mates, right? Because I could then go back and brag to them. Or if I got too smashed and I had shit sex, I had a funny story to tell them, right? So like all of it was, and pretty much most of the shit that I did during like that 16 to 19 years old was stuff that I did because I wanted to be validated by my group of male friends. And so it like really for like 3 to 4 years, like ate away at my sense of self and like my authenticity and my genuineness. And so like there was I was fortunate that I suffered a serious injury. I actually fractured my lower back, and so the fracture in my spine like slowed me down, man. And it, you know, through my clinical rehabilitation, I was introduced to Pilates, to yoga, to massage, to breath work, to meditation, to all these really beautiful body work modalities, essentially. And I recall, you know, halfway through a Pilates class, just like bursting out into tears, you know, like just doing this physical practice that, you know, was loosening up my hips and unlocking some tension in my lower back, and all of a sudden tears, you know, rising to the surface. And I remember like a yoga class trying to hold a particular posture, right? Like trying to hold this pose, and it just being really painful in my back, and all of this anger coming to the surface, you know, like disproportionate amount of anger for what was called for in that moment. And, you know, rage, I suppose would be a better word for it. And I was like, you know, 19 when this was happening. And like I said before, I was like still in that mindset of, fuck, I can't let my mates know that I'm crying in Pilates class, you know, with Boris, the old woman next to me, you know, like, or I can't let them know that I'm getting like really frustrated at yoga of all things. So I had this like mentality of like, I need to get rid of these emotions. I need to like not feel these. So that was my impetus for going and seeing a counselor. I was like, I got to see this counselor. They're going to tell me how to get rid of these emotions and not feel them, because I don't want these to be happening. Thankfully, I had a good counselor, and they were like, no, emotions are a good thing. You're supposed to have them. Let's just talk about emotional regulation and like what that looks like for you. And she put me onto a psychologist, and I did narrative therapy with my psychologist, probably for about another 3 or 4 years. Yeah. And the narrative therapy, for those that aren't familiar, I suppose, is essentially just like looking at all the stories that you tell yourself about what it means to be a man. I mean, what it means to be a human, but in my case, what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be a sexual being, and kind of discerning, okay, are these stories that have been imposed upon me from society, from religion, from my family, from wherever, from my mates? Or are these stories that come from me, right? That come from internal, ideas about what I want to be as a man or as a human being, and then figuring out like, are they helpful for you? Do they serve you? Are they helping you show up in a way that is authentic, that is genuine, that is beneficial to your mental health and to the lives of the people around you? And that's pretty much what I did, man, for a long time was figuring out what stories do I want to tell myself? Yeah. What narratives around masculinity and sexuality feel good to me that actually like make my life better and make the lives of people around me better. And so that's like, in a nutshell, why I do what I do today and why I'm really passionate about it is because I saw the transformative impact that not only doing the physical stuff like yoga, Pilates, meditation, massage, but also the talk therapy stuff, like the narrative therapy, how that changed the way that I related to the men in my life, how it changed the way I related to myself, how it changed the way I related to women. And because of the work that I do now, like how it improved my sex life dramatically. I was much less tense. I stopped drinking. I was much less tense. The anxiety that I had about like performing and being masculine or whatever that was for me at the time kind of drifted away. I stopped caring about it so much. I started asking the young women that I was being sexual with, like, what do you like? What turns you on? What's pleasurable for you? Like, let's explore that. Let's have some fun rather than being like, no, this is what sex has to look like. This is what it means to be a man. If I don't do this, I'm a failure. Like, just got rid of that. And then when I was talking to my mates, like if they said some shit that I disagreed with, like I had much more confidence and comfortableness speaking out against them because I, in the most compassionate way possible, I stopped giving a fuck what they thought about me, right? I stopped like basing my identity and self-worth on validation of their opinions, right? Like I was very much more secure in who I was and how I wanted to show up. And so I had more integrity in my own opinions and stopped following the crowd. And it drastically shifted like my direction in life, I suppose. I shared with you before the podcast that I was going to go into engineering. Yeah. And then this all kind of happened at around the same time that I was doing that. And I was just like, holy shit, like this is not the path for me, right? I was like really interested in psychology. I was like the guy who had psychology books and sex books and stuff on his bookshelf, and I had mates come over and they would like borrow a book. So I was always kind of interested in it. And I was like, oh, I can do this as a career. This is something I can actually pursue. And so it was like a culmination of all those factors, my personal experiences, the personal transformation that I had, and just, an interest in psychology and counseling and sexuality in particular, that kind of led me to where I am today. And as I said to you at the beginning of this whole rant, is, the stuff that I put out there into the world around masculinity, around sexuality and being, pleasure positive and being sex positive and exploring your body and being open and vulnerable and sharing about all that is stuff that I really wish when I was going through all this stuff 15 years ago, someone had been doing. Yeah. Because I had no role models. I had no men in my life who were a little bit knowledgeable, had a little bit of wisdom to share, had been around the block, lived experience, who were just like openly sharing about it. The only role models that I could think of at the time who I could find was people like Neil Strauss, who wrote The Game. Yeah. Right? So the pickup artist community was really it. The only guys I could find who were talking about masculinity and sexuality and not in a healthy way. No, not at all. So I fell into that a little bit. I did a bit of pickup artistry shit and quickly realized how fucked it was. But like that was those the only guys that were talking about it. And so I really try and be like a counterpoint for a lot of the men talking about sex in really unhealthy ways out there. Because there's a lot of guys doing it still. Yeah. Pickup artistry is still around. The seduction community is still around. A lot of guys talking utter nonsense when it comes to masculinity and sexuality. And so I try and do a little bit of like what we might call collective narrative therapy and just like offer a different narrative around masculinity. So yeah, man, I said I would be concise to you before our podcast. that was not concise. I apologize, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding.
I love this. I told you I love a good story. Thanks, and I love where that went because like when you're telling your story there, it reminded me a lot of my own journey, and I was in a similar space of I wish that I had someone who was having these conversations. I wish that this information was out there because for me it was similar when I was in uni, when I was in college. It was, I just want to avoid my feelings. And I was getting drunk, I was getting high, and just being with women, but being so disconnected. And for me, I wasn't aware at the time I was disconnected. It was like, it didn't make sense that my cock wouldn't work. It didn't make sense that I couldn't stay hard, or I couldn't get hard in the first place. And I'd just be like, oh, something's wrong with me. And I didn't go deeper than that. And the story I had at the time was, oh, there's just something wrong with me. And I didn't have the awareness. It meant, no, something is moving within me. I wasn't connected to it. And when I reflect, I was like, oh, I was in so much pain. I was unaware, and I was just avoiding that with drink and alcohol and women as well. And just saying like, oh, they were all escape mechanisms to avoid going into the feelings that I had. And like the way you're talking, it was like this connection to your sexuality was one of the starting points where maybe awareness came in that something wasn't right, that there was, the disconnect. And I'm curious for you at the time when you were having these experiences where maybe things weren't going the way you wanted, you were having premature ejaculation and all of that, that was there awareness that, something's not right on a deeper level, or was it just continuing to move through it like I did? I was like, I'm just going to bull charge through and just hope something changes.
Yeah, that's that like phrasing of like something's wrong with me, or like I'm broken. I hear that quite a lot in the men that work with me, and that was definitely something that came up during my like scratching at the surface of like what was going on for me sexually. I was like, and because guys don't really talk about sex with each other, right? So we don't really know how common sexual. I mean, we know statistically because the surveys have been done, but the average guy doesn't know how common like erection issues are, or how common like premature ejaculation issues are, because fellas don't talk about that stuff with one another. And so that was like a big learning for me, was like, I'm not actually broken. There's not actually anything necessarily wrong with me. I'm having a pretty common experience, a pretty normal experience. What can I do about this? You know, so I definitely had that first initial like, this is fucked. I'm broken. Something's wrong with me. But my curiosity was really strong. You know? And so, like I said, I was the guy that had the books on his bookcase, and I'd buy a book that was about like, sex and how to have better sex. Mantak Chia's book was on my bookcase, and then I had like Ian Kerner's book as well. It's like, they're all tips and tricks and strategies and techniques. Not a lot of like the deeper psychological stuff. I didn't get into that until I was a little bit more mature. But I was like, I can do some breathing stuff. I can do this squeezing thing. I can like, and I had a lot of curiosity about like, how can I get better at this? And originally, again, I don't want to give the impression that I was like this enlightened young man. Originally, it was because I was really concerned about my performance, right? Like I want to know how to finger a chick really well, right? Or I want to know how to go down on a chick really well, like because that was validating for my ego, right? And also, and I've shared this before, so I don't mind sharing it again, like I was struggling like with premature ejaculation, or even I was struggling with like getting an erection in the first place. And so my way of dealing with that was, I'll just go down on a chick, right? And if I can just make her come through oral sex, through like eating her out, then I don't need to worry about my dick so much, right? And so again, it was very much a way, I think you use the term like an escape, right? From actually dealing with the deeper issues. So that's how it started. But that like really put me onto like, oh shit, there's like things out there that you can do. And I, like I said, I was always really curious, and that's what I try and stoke in my clients is like, be curious, right? Like what is there that you can do? What other ways can you explore pleasure? A lot of guys, myself included, we like confine pleasure to our dick, right? Like it's, and if your dick's not working in a certain way, because we have expectations about our dick, if it's not like hard and it's like not, and if it doesn't ejaculate, then we're like, we can't experience pleasure. We've like really narrowed it down to this like really sticky white crotch sneeze, and it lasts for like 5 seconds. But if we reframe our relationship with pleasure to be like, I often say this to guys, like you're not just your dick, right? You're one big dick. You're a huge dick, and you can experience pleasure from the tips of your toes to the crown of your head. And so that's what I like encourage and give permission to with the men that I work with is like, you're allowed to explore your body. And there's stories that come up when guys start doing that, right? Like, is this weird? Is this, that same story, is something wrong with me? Like, am I weird or wrong for like exploring my chest or my nipples or my legs or God forbid my ass as well, right? Like that homophobia rears its head, even with guys who have like done work around like personal development and they're like not quote unquote homophobic. It still pops up of like, this is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. Like, what if I do this? What does it mean about my sexuality? What does it mean about my masculinity? Those narratives still pop up. So yeah, there's a lot of like self-imposed limitations on our experiences of pleasure specifically. And so that curiosity piece was like always really strong in me. And, you know, it doesn't have to be as strong in my clients, but I really try and get them to lean into some of that as well. Lean into their creativity as well. You know, I'll put the ball on their court and say like, what's a cool way that you could touch your body that feels good to you? You know, like it'll be completely different for me than it is to you. So I'm not going to necessarily prescribe you something to do. I might give them some principles to play around with, but like, you know, lean into that creativity, lean into the curiosity, lean into like the playfulness of sex and masturbation, because it's supposed to be playful. Right? It's kind of like how adults play is through sex and masturbation. Right? It's like our version of play. And that's why I'm a big proponent of like using toys as well. And that's only really been the last 2 years that I've been into, you know, toys, is because I'm an ambassador for a toy company. But that was like unknown to me, was like the amount of stigma of men using toys. And because there's this narrative of male sexuality is just like simple. You just jerk off with your hand, you just like ejaculate, you just come really quickly. Like it's just surface level, right? And so like guys that use toys, there's a stigma of them of being like a bit weird, or like, why are they doing it? Why do they need it? You know, like, why do they want to experience more pleasure, right? It's pleasure's for women, pleasure's not for men, right? Like that's kind of a bit of a narrative that pops up. So, and so I wasn't like super aware of that until I started promoting toys, and I started noticing like how there was a bit of pushback from not only men, but also women as well, right? Because women have the same stories about masculinity and sexuality that we have. So that was a really interesting, you know, I lent into my curiosity and started exploring toys in a big way. And then I was like, oh, okay. Like it was a big insight for me to be curious with my clients as well. And maybe if I suggested a toy to them and they went, oh, what the fuck? Why would I use a toy? It's like, interesting. Okay. Why do you think that? Like, where's that coming from? So, yes, I'm a big believer in curiosity being like the cornerstone of that phrasing, right? Of something's wrong with me. It's like, okay, why do you think that? Why do you think something's wrong with you? Or like if I'm broken, or even if you're like self-labeling, like I've got premature ejaculation, right? Or I've got erectile dysfunction. A lot of guys will say that to me. You know, I even have it on my intake form, you know, because that's the language that a lot of guys use. But a lot of men don't, right? They just think that they do because that's the language that we have, because we don't really talk about sex very holistically. We talk about it in a very like mechanistic way, right? Like, oh, I've got this dysfunction, I'm broken and I need to get it fixed. I need to resolve this problem. And, you know, I know the clinical criterion for premature ejaculation and erectile dysfunction because they're clinical definitions, right? They have clinical criterion as part of the DSM. And a lot of the guys that come in and work with me don't meet the clinical criterion. They don't meet the definition for those specific labels. But because that's how we've talked about masculinity and sexuality for so long, it's very like functional and, you know, and like, I just hate the word dysfunction, right? It shits me to tears, to be totally honest with you, because it's like, you're like a machine, right? And you're malfunctioning and you're like this fucking, you know, robot that doesn't have the right input or whatever. And it's just, that's how we've talked about male sexuality for so long. And it's just not humanistic at all. And it lends itself to like quick fixes like pills, you know, and we're seeing that with the rise of, I'm going on a massive rant right now.
Hit me. Come on, bring it.
We're going on like a tangent, but like, so why we're seeing the rise of like erectile dysfunction medication and, you know, PD, what they call PDE5 inhibitors, like they're being like massively overprescribed in my opinion, like because a guy has erectile dysfunction one time, or even it's my language, right? So a guy like struggles to get an erection one time and now all of a sudden he's got erectile dysfunction, right? And it's, and we can blame, you know, a bunch of things for that, like unrealistic expectations. But they're also now prescribing antidepressants to guys that have premature ejaculation, or to guys that think they have premature ejaculation. Because one of the side effects of SSRIs is like a dulled sense of arousal, right? So the theory is like, oh, we'll just give them low dose SSRIs. One of the side effects of which, right, is numbing you out.
Yeah.
And so, if we just numb you out, that'll help you last longer. Like, why are we numbing dudes out? You know, like the whole point of sex is to feel pleasure. And now we're just like, it's fucked, to be honest with you. Like we've over pathologized and over medicalized male sexuality because we've been treating it for so long as I'm broken, I need to be fixed, I'm dysfunctional, I'm, you know, this robot that, you know, the new input needs to be put in. So, and I'm not the first person to say that. This has been a narrative that's been talked about for like the last 40 years, you know, but we're just, I don't know, as a society, haven't taken it too seriously. But I see that a lot with guys. The reason why I'm like so passionate about it is because I see guys really internalize that message. Be like, I need you to fix me because something is wrong with me because I'm broken. And 95% of the time they're not broken. Nothing's wrong with them. They're having a very normal, common experience. And it's just about managing expectations and giving them opportunities to explore pleasure for pleasure's sake, not sexual function for performative sake, right? Like shifting from that performative model of sex to a much more pleasure-oriented model, rather than focusing on what sex looks like, focusing on what sex feels like. And that is difficult for a lot of guys because we haven't really been taught how to feel, right? And how to pay attention to our feelings. So, so there's a lot of barriers around it, you know, not only collectively for men, but also like individually for each man that I work with. And I will just pull the pin on that, man, because I will just keep talking unless you stop me. So,
I was going to let you see make this solo cast, man. I'm enjoying it deeply, and I think what we're touching on here is, for me, I know for so long I wanted to put myself in a box and be like, this is me, this is who I am, because there's a level of safety in that as a man. It's like, if I can say I'm this, I see it with some of my clients with labeling themselves outside of like the sexuality space, more in like the psychoanalytic way of, I have this, I have this diagnosis. And I'm like, do you really, or are you having a human experience that goes beyond what is considered normal in our society? Because it's like, here's a box, we can put you in it and tuck you away, because then we don't need to actually go into that and consider what is the deeper root cause. And for me, when I'm hearing this, and I know from my own experience, it's like, if I brought that energy of curiosity, which I have since then, it's like, no, there's nothing wrong with me. There's an opening here. There's something to be learnt. There's something to be explored. And I know when men actually begin to go down that path of, here's something for me. Here's a way to look at this in a new perspective. Maybe I can't have pleasure in my cock right now, or I can't get hard, and that's okay, but maybe it's still pleasurable. Maybe I can bring that pleasure up to my chest, maybe my neck. Like I had an experience recently where I was part of a self-pleasure group, and you know, for me, it was quite uncomfortable to be in a self-pleasure circle. Of like, first time to be in a co-gendered space like that. And if you listen to this and been like, what the fuck is that? It's exactly what it sounds like, but place to self-pleasure. And like a difference between self-pleasure and masturbation is there's no outcome focus. It's more about bringing it back to the pleasure of the body.
More of a mindful circle jerk, eh?
Yeah, mindful circle jerk. There's a clause in there, okay? And I found myself, I was getting into my head of, this needs to look a certain way. There's women in the space. I want to make sure I'm hard so they can see me and like I can be proud of my cock, basically, and look a certain way. And it was like just continuing to peel them stories back of, this isn't about them. This isn't about someone else's pleasure or how it looks. It's the embodied experience of eros, of sexual life force moving through us. And like when I started peeling back them layers, there's grief, like people are in ecstatic bliss, and I'm here crying in the corner with my cock in my hand. And it's like, cool, that's normal in this space. Like if we're actually peeling back the layers, we can go into that and, what's alive? Maybe sexuality isn't about pleasure at this point. There can be other emotions that arise as well. And this was one of the biggest learnings. And I've done this with partners. This was just more of a intense experience for me. It was like, in this, there is so much outside of the story. After that, it was a one-on-one session with a self-pleasure practitioner. And if you're familiar, it was like basically a witnessing of me in my self-pleasure by a practitioner who's been trained in it. And in it, the same thing happened. I want to impress them. I want to make them think this looks good and all of this. And when I was in that story, my cock wasn't responding to me. It was like, no, I'm not giving you anything. I'm not going to show what you want because that's not true for you right now. And it was just like, okay, where can I bring pleasure to my body? Where's the way into myself where I can just feel who I am and feel my pleasure, my eros? And I was like, oh, wow, my ribs, my neck, like I can kiss my arm and that feels incredible. And just letting go of all the layers of this needs to look a certain way. I need to show a performance, which I think is a big thing as a man. We're here to perform. We're here to give something, and to peel them layers back and just find the pleasure. And then once I was in that, my cock naturally got hard. There was no pressure anymore. There was no, oh, this isn't how it needs to look. And it felt so good at that point, because I had actually allowed entry into my own self without forcing it. And the slow opening and the softness that I feel as men, we often don't give ourselves. It's like permission to be slow, to be soft, to be more in our feminine energy, where we find pleasure in any part that we can.
I love that, man. And you're speaking to pretty much my approach to guys who talk to me about erectile dysfunction. They think that their cock's not working, right? And very often it's because they're in their head about like, I need my cock to work.
Yeah.
I need to, if for it to be hard, my wife's going to hate me, or she's going to leave me, or I'm not going to be able to satisfy her. Like it's the performance piece. Yeah. And when I give them the instruction or the guidance to be like, look, don't worry about what you look like right now. Drop into, does it feel good? What feels enjoyable to you right now? And maybe like, something I like to say as well is, a flaccid penis can feel as much pleasure as a erect penis, right? You don't gain any more nerve endings when your penis gets erect. You have the same amount of nerve endings, so you can experience the same amount of pleasure. But like I'll invite him, I'll be like, what feels good for you? Just explore your body, explore pleasure. And usually I'll do it, like I'll get him to do it with his hands. I'll invite him to like wake up his hands. There's a really beautiful practice from Betty Martin, which is just like touching a little object and spending a few moments like really caressing this object and noticing the sensations that arise in your hands. And then I'll get him to do that same thing, but with his body, and just like notice, like it slows you down and it like, it makes you focus on like pleasurable sensations, but ultimately it gets you out of your head. And when you let go of that story of like, God, I'm anxious about not having a hard dick, because that thought is what's killing your erection in the first place, right? So once you can let go of that and just focus on being in your body and exploring the pleasure, that is what, like, because we know the way that erections work is you need to be relaxed in your parasympathetic nervous system. And when you're anxious and stressed about not getting an erection, that's the thing that's stopping you from getting erection in the first place. So once you slow down and you do some breathing and you focus on touch and you focus on pleasure, like neurologically, you're giving yourself the best opportunity to get an erection. But then also like somatically and psychologically, you're focusing on pleasure, right? Which turns you on. Pleasure is arousing, right? And so you're giving yourself not only the neurological benefit, but also like the psychological benefit of just like noticing what feels good for you. And very often that's the remedy for erectile dysfunction, right? Unless there's a medical reason for it, very often that's the reason why you don't have an erection in the first place, is because you're in your head anxious about the whole experience. And that's because you're focused on performance, right? You're focused on like, I need this to happen, and if I don't make this happen, then sex is going to be a failure, or whatever your story is for it. So I love that share, man. Thank you for bringing that up, because it's so crucial for guys to like get to that space. And doing it in front of a practitioner would be like a really beautiful experience. You can do it in front of your partner. You can do it in front of a mirror. Like there's ways of eliciting that story really mindfully so that you can work with it. Because it's all well and good, like conceptualizing it here, listening to this podcast, like guys can be like, oh yeah, cool, that's landing for me. But until you like do it, until you like are in that moment and like have to pivot and force yourself to like go, oh, okay, I need to surrender into my touch and my pleasure. Like, that's where the learning is. Yeah.
So true. And like for me, where this goes beyond the self of like, oh, we're just bringing pleasure to myself. But in the past, I've been so focused on the pleasure of my partner and getting an outcome for her as well. And almost forcing her through that door. I need you to be wet. I need you to be like open right now. And it doesn't allow attunement to them as well. And like from me exploring my own body and tuning into it more, it's opened that doorway to be like, oh, what do I want to bring to my partner right now? What pleasure do I want to bring to her? Not what's expected, not what the book says of squeeze her tit, grab her ass, stroke her thigh. What actually is true in that moment, and beginning to notice that, because that's when aliveness happens, and that pressure that I used to put on like my partners was like, I need you to be this. So of course they shut down a little bit, contract, because they feel that I'm trying to get them somewhere rather than being with them in the moment. And for me, it's just such a big lesson. It's our own feminine, our own internal feminine where we've got to slow down, but also the external when we're with a partner, because that's when we notice, oh, what feels good to them? What does their body respond to? Oh, they feel a little bit closed right now. I'm not going to force this. I'm going to slow down and maybe check in and ask questions. And like you said earlier, bring curiosity. And I think that's such a powerful tool in any situation, because I know in the past, if I was having trouble, I'd just shut down, contract, and like want to crawl into a corner and hide away. And then in the moments where I'm like, oh, bring curiosity, speak into this and share, hey, this is alive for me. And maybe I need something. Maybe I just need to voice it. Maybe I don't need to hold that by myself and just be like, oh, this is in the space. And okay, where can we move from here? Where can we explore? Where can we go beyond just shutting down and closing off?
Yeah, there's a really great phrase that comes, or a saying, I suppose, or a question, whatever you want to call it, that comes out of the like gay community, which is, what are you into? Right. And it's just asking, and very often it's framed as like, are you into topping or bottoming, or are you a side? Like that's often how it's framed. But it's a great question to ask in general, right, of your partner, not only if it's the first time you're having sex with them or the 100th time you're having sex with them, like, what are you into? What's turning on right now? What do you want to do? And giving them an opportunity to like voice desire. And then you can follow up with questions of like, okay, what don't you want to do? What aren't you into? And like give an opportunity to voice boundaries. But like leading with curiosity has to be. I don't know how else you are supposed to approach sex, because as soon as you start not being curious about your partner, that's when you start putting pressure on them, right? Yeah. And one of the major reasons why a lot of women will fake orgasms is because they feel like their partner is trying to get them to orgasm in the first place, because they're, I've had so many women say to me, from their experiences with their male partners, that like he's like doing the move, like squeezing her tit or like running her hand, like his hand up her inner thigh, like trying to get her to come, trying to like do something, the technique, the move to make her have an orgasm. And she's like, so I just do it because I don't want to hurt his feelings. Right. And it's, and he doesn't ask me if that's what I like. There's no communication piece happening. He's just doing it because he thinks that's what I like. And I haven't spoken up about it. And she hasn't spoken up about it because she cares about him, right? Which is like oxymoronic, right? Yeah. Because you would think, oh, well, if she cared about him, wouldn't she speak up about it? And one of the reasons why a lot of women don't speak up about it is to something you shared just before, is because a lot of guys take it really personally and they close down and they contract, they constrict, and they go, because their ego's wrapped up in their sexual performance, right? And giving their partner pleasure and doing sex to their partner. If they get feedback that's like, hey, I actually don't really like that. And especially if it's like not the first like time they're having sex, if they've been doing that for like a couple of years, and the wife or the girlfriend says like, hey, you know that thing that you do that you've been doing for like 5 years? I actually don't really like it. Like that's a blow, like that cuts deep for a lot of guys. And like, so that's valid, that it hurts. But that's like one of the major reasons why a lot of women don't speak up in those moments, is because guys take it really personally. And so like, that's where the curiosity piece needs to be like at the forefront. But even like beyond that, some of the things I like to talk about is, like flexibility, creativity, and spontaneity, right? So like, if you can blend those three things, when you get feedback from your partner, that's like, hey, I don't actually really find that very enjoyable when you do this. It doesn't hurt, but it's not my cup of tea. I don't really like it. Can you be flexible in that moment, right? Like, can you be like, oh, okay, cool, no worries. Like, sure, that's fine. Like, appreciate you telling me. Thank you. Right. The flexibility to like do something else. But that's when like spontaneity and creativity come in, right? Because like, if your partner says no to one thing, can you spontaneously be like, great, cool. Let's do this instead, right? Let's try this. Like, how about, I got this other thing that I want to try. Do you want to give that a shot? And that's where your creativity needs to like come to life. You're like, all right, cool. You don't like that position, or that's quite like painful for you. and this was especially true for me, if I speak personally, when my wife was heavily pregnant, right? Because there were things that you just can't do with a heavily pregnant woman that you can do with someone who's not pregnant. And she had to feed that back to me. I was like, oh, okay, shit, I didn't realize that. Can I think on my feet right now? Can I roll with the punches and be like, great, let's pivot to this position, or let's pivot to like this type of stimulation, or like, let's get this toy out and just not worry about trying to do penetration right now. Like, let's move to a different act. And that is, it's a learned skill. You know, like you don't know what you don't know. You know, so part of it's got to be like, okay, cool, there are other ways of having sex. There's other positions you can try. There's other and so that's why, even though they're a bit like shallow and surface level, I find value in like the 101 sex position books, that just like have a bunch of stuff, because you need to use them sometimes, because there'll be a position that maybe your back's fucked. Like I have a fucked back because of my injury. So there's times where I'm like, babe, I cannot hold this position, right? Because it just hurts and I can't do it. So I've got to think of my feet, and she's got to think on her feet as well. I'd be like, all right, cool, let's try this. Let's maybe get into a sitting position or whatever it is. And so that's where like having that catalog of like 101 sex positions is like helpful. And so I'll share that with my clients as well, just to kind of get the ball rolling with their creativity. And then like I'll talk to them about like the pivot, so like if they're in the middle of a sex act and their partner shares them, hey, it's not actually really doing it for me. Or if it's not doing it for him as well, and he's like, yeah, this is not really my cup of tea. Can you voice that, and can you pivot somewhere, right? And I frame this as being a sexual leader. You know, like if you can hold that energy or hold that container of like, this ain't really doing it for me, but that's not the end of the world, right? Because a lot of, and this comes from my own personal experience as well, if I, am candid, if I got feedback of like, this isn't enjoyable, I'd be like, sex is finished.
Yeah.
And same thing, for guys that I've spoke about, if they're like, if he's getting a blowjob, if he's receiving oral sex and he's like, yeah, this is not very good, it's like done, right? Sex is finished. And I speak to a lot of guys who find it really difficult to orgasm from receiving a blowjob. And I'm like, well, so why don't you switch to something else? Why don't you do something else then? And they kind of go, well, I'm allowed to do that? Like it's kind of like, because there's the unwritten expectation of like, this is what we're doing. And if this doesn't work, then sex is off the table, sex is finished, right? Same thing with guys, if they struggle to get an erection, oh shit, well then that means sex isn't on the table, right? A lot of it's based around what his cock does, or doesn't do, for want of a better term. So same thing with ejaculation. If a guy comes, sex is finished, right? Like there's a lot of like unwritten rules around sex that we just kind of adhere to because no one's really talked to us about it, or no one's given us the opportunity to like unpack why we think those things. And so like the word here that comes to mind is phallocentrism, right? It's like whether his dick is hard or not and whether his dick has ejaculated or not determine whether sex is happening or not, right? And so like just like disentangling that. So part of it is like exploring pleasure around your whole body, decentralizing your cock, right? Like exploring oral sex, digital sex, using toys, things like that. But it gives you an opportunity to pivot in the moments when, not if, but when you like lose your erection or you come quite quickly. You're like, oh shit, fuck, I wasn't expecting that. But like, if you can hold that energy of like, hey, it's not a big deal. I'm not going anywhere. I still love you, or I still want to have sex with you. I still desire you. I still think you're attractive. Let's do something else. Like, if you can hold that energy and that frame of reference, that's what being a leader is sexually. Like that in my opinion, it's as simple as that. Easy said than done, because like a lot of stuff can come up, like a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of embarrassment if we come quite quickly. Exactly, like especially if we're with someone who we find really attractive. But like cultivating that mentality of not a big deal. I can still be here in the space with you. I'm not taking it personally. Like that is almost like lateral leadership, like horizontal leadership. It's not hierarchical. It's not like delegatory, like do this, do that. It's like leading by example and creating safety, which is what we want to do as our partners. We want to create safety for them to open up, be vulnerable, explore their sexuality, tell us their turn-ons, tell us their boundaries. If we don't create safety for them to do that, then sex is not going to be as great as it could be if we had done that. And so, holding that mentality or holding that energy of like, talk to me. Like, what's going on? It's not a big deal. Like, I don't mind if you say that you don't like this, or if you really like this thing that I've never done, but you saw it in porn or another partner did it. Like, tell me. Like, I want to know. I'll cop it on the chin. You know, I'm not going to take it personally and call you a slur and then never want to have sex with you again. Like, but that's what a lot of guys unintentionally do because their ego is so wrapped up in their performance of sexuality. I'll leave it there.
I feel with so much of this, and I can see it in myself, is the level of seriousness that we can treat sex with and bring that seriousness in and be like, oh, this is the most important thing ever. If it doesn't go this way, it means this. And like the element that you mentioned earlier of play and being willing to bring that, I think is such an important aspect of this, where it's like, oh, this is play. This is an experience that goes beyond just an end result. It's not looking for an outcome. It's not looking for a fin, but we're two humans here to enjoy pleasure. We're here to play with one another, get to know each other, like see what that can look like, wrestle around on the ground and bring that energy of, oh, this is exploration. This isn't a travel to get somewhere. This is an exploration together. We're in a little bit of a foreign land. Let's have some fun with that. Like, let's frolic around. Let's get a little wild. Let's get a little experimental and bring that energy of, oh, the world's open for me and we can discover anything together and we're not looking for an outcome. And when I see this, when I see the level of exploration that this, if a man or a woman is to go into this and allow themselves to truly explore, say, in sexuality, it opens up so many possibilities outside of the space. And when I'm talking about this, I see sex as a microcosm for the macrocosm of life. So a person's sexuality, like sexual energy as life force energy, it obviously wraps over to other areas, and being like, oh, if a person is willing to explore sexually, explore creatively in sex, they're going to have all these effects in other areas of their life. So when you're working with men and they come to you, however they do, and then you take them through your journey, what are some of the things that you notice in them that begins to change as they begin to connect deeper to their sexuality and open in that way?
Yes, that's a really great question, man. And I appreciate the insight as well. Like there's an experience of pleasure of life in general. You know, like we oftentimes compartmentalize, as I said before, pleasure to orgasm. But pleasure is like a cup of tea, you know, or the feeling of the sand in between your toes when you're walking on the beach, or the smell of the woods as you walk through your favorite enclave. Like there's so many pleasurable things in life that fall by the wayside because we have compartmentalized pleasure to like heightened states of sexual arousal. So when I do work with men and they start to experience that full spectrum pleasure, they enjoy life a lot more because they're noticing the things that like feel good to them, you know, and there's like I said before, like there's a permission piece for them to explore that as well. They kind of go, oh shit, you're right. I do enjoy chocolate late at night when I'm watching this TV show, right? To be honest, that's my pleasure as well. I love dark chocolate and I love watching like wholesome TV shows and sometimes not so wholesome. I'll say that as well. I love like a good gritty TV show that like evokes a different type of pleasure, right? But it's, like I said before, it's the full spectrum, right? And noticing the subtleties and noticing the intensities. So there's a more enjoyment of life is the first thing. The other one is there's more communication at work. So a lot of the guys that I work with come from like corporate backgrounds. So they're like either working, you know, some guys that work in tech. I've got a couple of guys who are doctors, a couple of guys who work as tradies, and one guy who I'm working with at the moment who works as a religious clergyman, actually. But a lot of it is, you know, they're not necessarily speaking up for themselves. You know, they're going through the motions at work. They're kind of putting the hours in and you know, getting the paycheck, essentially. And something that I notice when I do work with these guys over time, and we start like, I get them to open up about like what it is that turns them on, what it is that they desire, what are their fantasies, right? And then once that kind of hurdle has been cleared, then it's like, all right, well, let's talk about how you can ask for those things. You know, ask your partner to explore this particular thing that you've maybe been inspired by from watching porn, or like you've just had this fantasy, you always wanted to do it, but you've always felt insecure about asking about it or voicing it, or it could be a boundary, right? Like maybe you've been doing this thing your whole life and you actually don't enjoy it, but you feel really like reluctant to say that you don't enjoy it, right? Because you're a guy and guys are supposed to enjoy sex, right? Like every sexual thing guys are supposed to enjoy, which is not true. So like, how can we voice that boundary? How can we like assert it and bring it to the forefront? So I noticed that skill that they build in the cauldron of sexuality, right, in the arena of sexuality, starts to then ripple out into other areas of their life. So could be, and I said work immediately, but like it could even be their relationship with their family. They start to like maybe put a bit more boundaries up around some of the guys I work with are new dads. And so like they put a boundary up around their parents that are maybe being a bit too imposing as grandparents, you know? And so they have conversations with their mum or they're with their dad about like, hey, this is a boundary for me, or hey, if you want to help, this is how you can help. This is what I need in terms of support. Like, here's what you can do. So they ask for things a bit more, rather than like trying to lone wolf it, as a lot of guys want to do. And then, you know, at work, it could be saying no to working on the weekend or to working that overtime, prioritizing, you know, pleasure, prioritizing like life rather than just working and going through the motions and doing it for the sake of doing it. I remember one guy who was an architect who would just like work every weekend, and it was like putting a massive strain on his relationship with his partner. And when we started working around like, you know, putting boundaries up and speaking into what he desires, he was like, I want to be having more sex. I want to be like exploring more with my partner. I want to go and do things with it. And I was like, mate, you're not giving yourself an opportunity to do that because of your work, right? Yeah. And he was like, yeah, true. I was like, do you have to work on the weekends? He was like, not particularly. And so I was like, all right, so what's the reluctance piece here? What's stopping you from doing this? And he's like, well, I've never done it. I've never said that I don't want to work on the weekend. They just assume that I do. I was like, all right, great. Perfect opportunity for you to like lean into this skill that we're building to say, hey, I'm not doing this weekend, right? And didn't have to be that blunt about it, but that's how I framed it. And he started doing that. He started saying like taking one day off on the weekend, and then he started taking 2 days off, and that gave him the opportunity to do the things that he wanted to do with his partner. And so that was a direct like correlation between his skill set building and communication skills, and then transitioning that into work. So yeah, it's like, I often say that like our sexual identity or our sexuality is inextricably linked to who we are as human beings. You know, whether you express it a lot and you're like really giving with your sexual energy, and you know, you can tell those people that are like really flirty and like really giving, and they overflow with sexual energy and it like really comes out of them, whether that's part of your, you know, sexual expression, like that's going to influence the way you interact with people around you, or whether you're quite reserved. And there's nothing wrong with being reserved with your sexual energy. Maybe you keep it a bit more contained, maybe put a lid on it a little bit more. That's what feels comfortable to you. That's going to influence the way that you interact with the world around you. And one is not better than the other. I think we do fall into a bit of a trap of being like, the more flowing and sexual you are, the like better it is. That's definitely true in like the sacred sexuality space. That tends to be like the ideal, right? But you don't have to do that, you know. And like I said, one is not better than the other. But it's important to acknowledge that it will inform the way that you interact with your parents, your lovers, your children, your boss, your colleagues, religious authorities, right? Like your sexuality plays a part in all of those relationships. And so the less you understand about your sexuality, the less that you're aware and that you've done, you know, you've developed your sexuality or your understanding of it, that's going to be influencing your relationships as well, and relationships with everyone around you. So like if there's a part of yourself, which typically there is around sexuality, that has a lot of shame associated with it, like that's going to show up in your relationships. You know, if there's a lot of tension around your sexuality because you've been shamed for it, or like you've had negative past experiences, that's going to influence the way that you show up in the world. So, so I definitely think that like unpacking sexuality and going through like a bit of a journey on with regards to your sexual self dramatically shifts the way that you interact with the world around you.
There was a word you said, a way to describe what these men begin to experience, full spectrum. And that feels so true, because when I consider sexuality and what could be generally shamed in sexuality as a man, when I reflect on my own period, like we talked about the homophobia of, exploring our own arse or something like that, or pleasure around the body. And it's like, cool, I shut off from half this experience. Or, for me, I think of that and I'm like, oh, sex is meant to be clean, it's really shiny and all of that. But can be a messiness, a grotesqueness and a dirtiness to sex that if we learn to embrace that and enjoy that, it does open that full spectrum. And like when I look at society and I look at our culture, it's like, oh, we kind of want this tamed down version of a lot of things. It's like, can this just be safe? Can it just be white walls and a shiny room and I don't get to see the shit in the toilet and it just flushes away? Like a lot of our world is built around that, and it can map over to sex, and people be like, oh, that's dirty or that's gross and I can't have that because that's wrong. But when we close off from that, like you were talking about these experiences coming in, I know for me a big point was integrating more my wildness in sex, my aggressiveness and my assertiveness, and actually owning that. And I think this is something that a lot of men go through, of being afraid to own that aspect because it could be dangerous or it's unruly, or that's not what a man is. A man is always nice and pleasant to a woman, and that's a lot of the conditioning I had myself. And yet when I know I've started to own that more, when I've been willing to be more dominant and been willing to show that, I see how in other areas of my life that comes out. Maybe I'm willing to confront a man about a conversation. I'm like, hey man, I'm not okay with that, and have that conversation, which, it's difficult, it's scary, but I know I have that access to that animal part, which some of it I've gained through sexual experiences, others being men's work and all of that, but an access point where we get to see, this is safe. I can use this. I can have this experience, and then other areas be immediately affected, and especially more, I find the wildness, more the darker aspects of life that a lot of men in nowadays, we've got the nice guy, the people pleaser that they can be disconnected from. And so when they begin to engage in, maybe if they're exploring kink or something a little bit on the taboo side of sexuality, it gives an access into this, being like, what's role play? What's it look like to be a dominant and a sub? What's it look like to, be tying someone up or being tied up? And it's like, there's a whole new experience here. There's something I've never known. And then having that access, bringing that to other areas of life is so powerful.
Yeah, I am reminded of a French philosopher called Jean Baudrillard, who talks about pornography quite a lot. And one of the things he talks about is how pornography, the framework of it is what he refers to as hyper-realism. And I relate this back to what you said about like, we want sex to be like clean, and we want sex to be, to look perfect and look a certain way. And we've kind of done that in our, everyday lives with, you talk about like flushing shit down the toilet and like not having to deal with it. And so he talks about like how in pornography, this hyper-realism is like it plays out with like, nothing goes wrong in porn. Like what you see on screen is not reality. It's hyper reality in the sense that like, there's no dirtiness to it. Maybe there's dirtiness in the sense of like, this is like some dirty kind of, film, but like, there's no STIs in porn. There's no concern about bodily fluids. Like there's like everything is cleaned, and there's no worry about consent or rejection, right? Like all the things that make sex in reality are scrubbed clean in pornography, right? And so one of the reasons why, at least in my opinion, we have these expectations around what sex should look like and why it should be so easy, and why we have unrealistic expectations around like erections, for example. Like when was the last time you saw a flaccid penis in pornography? They like don't exist, right? Against the scrubbing out of anything that quote unquote could go wrong, right? Or any concern or any worry. There's none of that in pornography, right? Because that's not a realistic representation of sex. It's a hyper realistic representation. And so that's what your, that first sharing really reminded me of, is like, we have these unrealistic expectations around sex from media, right? And it's not just porn, it's in the movies as well. Like nothing goes, well, maybe if it's for comedic effect, right? And it's to make fun of the male character, then, you know, something goes wrong. And it's very, very often to make fun at how emasculated that male character is. Like that's really important, which a lot of guys internalize. And they're like, if something goes wrong in sex, it's my fault and I'm less of a man. But in a lot of movies, like everyone comes together, you know, like literally like they orgasm at the same time, you know, like guys don't have erection issues, like they're all chiseled fucking, juiced up fucking superheroes. And so, like, so we have these really unrealistic expectations around sex, which need a lot of unpacking. Forgot where I was going with that second part. Oh, right. The wild man, right? Like exploring that wilder energy. Yes. That is something that is, comes up a lot for the guys that I work with is I want like a desire to do that, but also a concern of like not crossing a boundary for a partner. So there's like I want to be more dominant, I want to be more assertive, but I want to be respectful of my partner. And, you know, this plays into like that Madonna whore complex, right? Of like, I want, and it's a real phenomenon. Like the Madonna whore complex, yes, is a way of thinking about like femininity in women, but it's also something that plays out particularly in like longer term relationships is, like I love my partner so much that I don't want to quote unquote degrade them or disrespect them in the bedroom. Right. And very often that the quote unquote degrading or disrespecting is like that ravishing, like deeply animalistic sex, right? It's like, well, I don't want to have sex with my partner like that because I love her too much, you know? And so a lot of guys get trapped in that. One of the reasons why is because we have this clashing of roles, right? Of a lover and a family member. Right? Like, so I think of the people that are your family members, right? Your parents, your siblings, your children. You don't have sex with those people. But then you've got this other person who is a family member, especially if you're married to them, right? And if they've had your children, they are like, for all intents and purposes, a family member by blood and by law. But you also have sex with them, right? And so you've got these internal conflicts here, like psychologically speaking, these two roles that your partner fulfills, which are at odds with one another. And so one of the explorations of couples work is essentially like, how do I reconcile those two roles? And how do I maybe create a bit of distance between them so that I can see my partner as a lover, as someone that I can have like animalistic, like ferocious, you know, wild sex with. But then how do I also treat them as the mother of my children, the love of my life, the wife, right? The family member that they are. And some of that looks like, you know, this is, from my observation, that's what polarity work is, right? Is like trying to disentangle those two roles. I don't really like the term polarity. I don't really use it in my work. But what I see people talking about when it comes to polarity is essentially that dilemma, right? Of how do I disentangle those two roles so I can have a partner who is a lover, not a family member, but then when we're not in the bedroom and having these erotic experiences, how can they be my family member? How can they be my partner? And so reconciling those two roles is really interesting. One of the ways is like creating a little bit of energetic distance. A very simple example that I share, and this is going to be a sweeping stereotype, so people can apply this in whatever way they want. But I'll say, you know, I work with heterosexual couples. I'll say to the guy, go and do something that makes you feel masculine. Right. And so here's the stereotype is like, go and chop some wood. You know, go and do some fucking lumberjack shit and do that for an hour. And I'll say to her, go out for an hour and do something that makes you feel really feminine. And again, the stereotype here is like, I'll say, go have a bubble bath. You know, go and light some candles, have a glass of wine, and, you know, just enjoy the sensation of a bubble bath. Then come back to one another after that hour and notice what happens. Notice any eroticism or erotic charge, like make it a part of like a date afternoon, you know, for you to go and do those things, come back to one another with the intention of like connecting erotically, and not with the agenda of like, we're going to have sex, but of like, just notice what comes up, right? When you're in each other's space again and you've done something that makes you feel fucking virile and she's done something that makes her feel like soft and gooey and surrendered, just notice how that makes you feel, right? And I use those stereotypes, but you could do whatever. If going and doing, you know, if going and dancing makes you feel really masculine, right? If, you know, I say that because I have a client who does like Shakespearean, like plays and like him doing his roles and like moving around on stage and like really following that script makes him feel really masculine, makes him feel really powerful. So he does that, you know, he goes and rehearses for his play and then comes back to his partner. So it doesn't matter what the thing is, as long as it specifically makes you feel like powerful and strong. And the thing that your partner does that like makes them feel like soft and receptive, and come back to each other and notice how that feels, and then switch it, play around with it, and then notice what happens. Like you go and do something that makes you feel real soft and receptive, and invite your partner to go do something that makes her feel really like in charge and assertive. Come back to each other, notice, right? Like, you know, we get so prescriptive in, this is one of my gripes with polarity coaches, I will say, is like, there is so much like, this is the way it should be done. This is what polarity is. This is what being masculine is. And it's like, shut up, bro. Like, just allow people to figure it out for themselves, right? Like, yeah, sure, give them ideas. And that's why I'm kind of like saying, this is a stereotype. This is what I suggest. But the principle is like, what does it feel like for you? Right? And then just play around with it. Who gives a fuck if you're like the feminine and they're like the masculine and or vice versa? Like, people can get so in their head about that they forget about just like noticing how it feels. You know, like they get hyper vigilant about like, oh, am I masculine now? Or I've got to do this so that she can be in her feminine. It's like, forget all that. Right. Like just come back to like, does this feel fucking good for me right now? And then play around with like what those things are that make you feel good. So that's my invitation for people listening is like, go and just explore those dynamics. Go and do something that makes you feel really soft and gooey while your partner does something else. Come back, notice, just pay attention to how that feels. I
love this piece around, I'd consider what you're talking about aliveness between two people or in yourself even. And I've had similar things with the polarity space of like a man's a man, and like it's still this outdated thing of man's masculine. No, we're both, and we can flow between them and embrace them all. And I found when I'm with a partner who can, like, if I'm in my feminine, I want to be able to soften and her to hold me as well. I don't want to always have to be anyway. I want to be able to flow in between, and I notice when that occurs, there's so much aliveness. So I love this invitation to really heighten that and see what happens, see how that feels. And like with that, I can imagine that there can be some conditioned responses that come up. Oh, I'm too soft now. I've got to be a man. I've got to be strong. I've got to be tough. But actually allowing ourselves to experience that and maybe be held in that for a first time or be in that state, because we're not here to be one pole or the other. We're here to, for me, experience a full spectrum of ourselves and being like, oh, I can connect to my feminine and it's safe with my partner. Like going back to what you said, safety being a key in any relationship and the importance of being able to hold that, oh, I don't need to be anyway. Like for me, a relationship is a thing that allows us to peel back the layers, not become more of who we think we should be, but become more of who we are. And if there's rules that I have to be masculine, she has to be in her feminine, there's a limitation there. There's another box that society wants to put us in. And it's coming back to that question of who do I really want to be and what does that look like? And I think with your work of sexuality being so ingrained in the aliveness of the moment, that this is such a vital way to actually come to that place where I'm attuned to the moment, I'm attuned to what's alive and being like, does this feel good? Is this increasing aliveness in my being, in my state, and making me feel more deeply in the world? Or am I taking a step back, becoming more disconnected, being more in my head and being like, no, like something's off there?
Yeah, man. That lands for me in terms of, you know, as men, we can show up in the world. I mean, there's a few like really strong, if I like circle way back to the first thing I shared, right? There's a few really strong narratives around what it means to be a man in the world, right? Like protect, provide, you know, like that's a very historical and quote unquote traditional narrative around masculinity, but it's also really boxed in, right? It's very limiting. And, you know, it's in a way, it's like devoid of like who we are, because it's oriented towards who are we protecting, who are we providing for, right? Like it's oriented towards the other, which is noble. And, you know, I don't want to say that it's not valuable, but like, if we don't have someone to protect, if we don't have someone to provide for, which is like a lot of men's approach to life and masculinity, what's left? right? And so a lot of guys don't have anything left, you know what I mean? Like it's based in lack. It's based in like, oh, I need to have someone else in order to validate my masculinity. And when those things aren't there, or men perceive that those things aren't there, then there's like a deep sense of like, holy shit, I'm not a man. I'm not masculine. I'm not doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing for me to assert my masculinity. And so, like I said, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, like protecting, providing, presiding, whatever you're fucking, there's a bunch of P's that I hear people say. Like, you can do those things. Yeah. And that's valuable and it's noble and it's necessary and it's great. But also, or maybe not and also, like, what is at the center of that, right? When you take the things away, like, for example, like, you know, I went on a podcast with a colleague and a friend of mine who has a disability. He's got cerebral palsy. And he's been in a wheelchair his whole life. And something that he said to me, which he says all the time, but like when he said it to me, it really struck me, is like, you know, it's not about if you become disabled and you have like a horrible accident, it's when you become disabled. Because at some point in our life, as we age, we're going to get a disability, right? And so very often, if you've got, you know, I use this because it's just at front of mind with regards to this conversation. His name's Andrew Gerzer, for people that are interested. Andrew and I were talking about like masculinity, right? And so he's never really been able to, quote unquote, protect, provide, because of his cerebral palsy. And so like he was forced to reflect on like, what does masculinity mean for him then if he doesn't fit that traditional model of like protecting, providing, presiding, because he physically can't do that.
Yeah.
So like he got me thinking about like, oh, well, shit, what if I'm oriented towards like protecting, providing my partner and I can't do that, what's left for me, right? And if there's nothing there, if I've not done that work of like self-identity and like having masculinity that means something to me, that is related to me, not related to the other, then no wonder guys are depressed, right? Like no wonder guys are you know, have, you know, suicide rates higher than women. It's because a lot of guys are feeling like they can't do these things that we've been telling them that they should be doing. We haven't given them the tools to like reflect on their own experience of what masculinity means for them, right? Not for others. And so that's like a big thing that's coming to my mind with regards to this work, right? Is like the pleasure of life, you know, the pleasure of being in your body, right? The self-pleasure, right? Like a lot of these things that I am trying to teach and trying to like give men an invitation to explore is stuff that isn't oriented towards others, right? Stuff that's oriented towards themselves, and not in a narcissistic way, but in a way that's like self-meaning, right? Self-identifying, so that if those things are ever taken away, they don't just feel like they're nothing. Because that's what a lot of guys do end up feeling by default, because they haven't been given this alternative narrative of masculinity.
And it goes back to that piece around like in sex, are we doing it for performance or are we doing it to be in the moment and in pleasure in the moment? And that's such a key piece. It's like, oh, if I'm looking outside myself for everything, if I'm giving myself away, like there's so much important stuff that happens around and our attention needs to be outside of ourselves. But for me, first, it needs to come to me. Like when I consider the pillars of my life, myself needs to be first, relationship and purpose are outside of that. And relationships as a whole, not just partner. But they need to be like the outside pillars of that middle pillar of self. Because without that, it's unstable. There's no middle pillar to hold everything up. And I've seen that in myself where it's like, oh, my business, my relationship are everything. And I ended up numb, dissociative, empty, because over and over again, I was like, oh, if I give more, if I prove that I'm worthy, and this was the thing that I think a lot of men do, they do this to prove that they're worthy, that then they can receive love, that then they can get what they want in this world, and that then they'll be okay to relax or whatever it is, and they can get there and they'll be finally there and happily ever after. But no, it needs to come from the other place of self before all of that. So we actually have that overflowing cup for a relationship, for our purpose, for our work, whatever it is, because otherwise it's empty. And I've found that so deeply. And I think self-pleasure is one of the most important ways to recognize that, because, oh, I'm doing this for me. There's no one else around. I'm not putting on a show. I'm not like trying to curate an experience. I'm not trying to get somewhere. And if I am, I'm recognizing that something's off because I'm still trying to get somewhere, and that's not what we're trying to do in this. It's like, give back. What do we do for ourselves, just ourselves? Maybe it's learning, but maybe it's fun. Like coming back to the element of play and sexuality, like for me, play in life is one of the most important things I need to be doing as a man to feel full. And I think what you're speaking to about bringing that play to our sex lives is a great place of where it will map over into every area of our life. And then we can play, we can explore and be like, the pleasure of life.
Yeah, dude. I love you sharing that, man. Thank you so much. And look, I'm mindful of time as well, brother, and curious, are you keeping time for us?
No, I am not. But I feel like that is about...
it feels like a complete conversation for me around ending on play because it's so integral, man. And I'm a big believer in it, and I'm glad that it's something that's important for you as well, dude, and that you're sharing it because it's super necessary.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, Cam, I just want to give a spot. If there's anything you want to share with the audience, and anything you want to finally finish on, or anything you've got coming up that you want to put out there as well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, dude, people can reach out to me on social media. I'm always happy to field questions. I'm at the Cam Fraser on all social media platforms. I got a potty myself, which I'm going to invite you onto, mate, called Men, Sex and Pleasure. And it's pretty much these types of conversations. If I want to plug something, I've got a course for men, 6-week online course called Outperform a Porn Star, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek because we talked about how performance is bad, right? But the idea behind the course is like if you could have deeply pleasurable, multi-orgasmic, connected sex with yourself and also with another person, you'd be outperforming any porn star. You'd be having way better sex than anything you see on screen. So the title is a bit tongue-in-cheek. I'm thinking of changing it because I always have to explain it. So
I love it.
Yeah, it's great. It's catchy, but it may be not conducive for understanding it. And if guys want to check that out, that's like you get lifetime access to it. It's 6 weeks, but it's self-paced, and there's a lot of really good material in there. So yeah, man.
Cam, absolute pleasure. If anyone's listened to this, really check out Cam's work. I appreciate him as a man. I've been following along for a while. I've got so much value from this conversation. Thank you, brother. If anyone wants to find me on Instagram at the Dean Bentley. And thank you for joining us for another episode of The Weird Way. So much love. Peace.